Hello, everybody, and welcome to
It's your time you're wasting with me, David Didow.
and me, Martin Robinson.
Martin, how have you been?
I've been very hot. It's very hot
Oh,
here.
really?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
it's
I
it's like
think it.
summer.
Yeah, it's a bit like summer. It's going to get warmer. I'm told.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
sunny. So
Well, we shouldn't moan about that because by the time it's August, it'll be freezing and rainy, won't it? So let's just make the most of it. Um, right. Okay. Well, we've had some technical issues this morning, so fingers crossed. I say we've had some technical. I've had some technical issues. So if anything goes wrong, it's entirely my fault, never Martin's. But what we're attempting to talk about this week is assessment. And we're going to look at the idea of the fact that, in many people's opinion, assessment is high stakes and low trust, or just confused. We're going to dive into what's under review, the sorts of things that are making headlines right now, and a little bit on what students and teachers actually think. But before we get into all of that, Martin, what do people need to do?
they need to like and subscribe on YouTube and also on our various other podcast channels. Could they please, whatever they do on that, follow? They follow on that, I
Yeah,
think, and
they've.
they can.
Did you did you get that email from Podbean I forwarded to you?
We've had a thousand downloads
Yeah, it's
since we've been
nice.
there, and
Yeah, we're
also
pleased.
a thousand. We're nearly got a thousand subscribers on YouTube. We're just about 15 off that. So please, please,
And that's a milestone because once we've got 1,000 subscribers, we can start making the big bucks,
big
apparently.
bucks of 20p a week or something like that. Yeah, that would be
Something
lovely.
like that. So yeah. We might be able, after a couple of weeks, buy a stamp.
A stamp, yes. Well, a couple of years, I think, before buying a stamp, but you never know.
Yeah, okay. Wow. 20p a week. I think what do stamps cost now?
I've got absolutely no idea. I just send emails, except to Christmas.
Yeah,
Funnily enough.
okay. Well, you don't send emails at Christmas.
No, I just send stamps. Christmas. Just send them into the ether. Gifts. They're gifts. Have a stamp. Are you all right?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just imagining the Robinson Christmas.
Dude, you've lost it.
Ah, apologies. Right, I was just.
Anyway, on that note,
I'm a bit hysterical now. Apologies. Right, okay.
it's very
Right,
hot in
stop
the
it.
West
Stop it,
Country, isn't it?
Martin. Stop it.
It's very hot down Somerset Way.
No, it's actually, well, it's hot, but it's quite cool in my kitchen. So
Okay, that's nice.
don't know why, but it's quite comfortable. Yeah, it's hot outside. Right, okay. So after all of that hilarity, yeah, let's. So we know that curriculum and assessment is under review right now here in the UK. Back in March, the review body released an interim report where amongst other things, they talked about the fact that they did make some critical noises about assessment. So they talked about the fact that the courses are there's too much in various GCSE courses and too much therefore in the GCSEs are assessing them, and that's something that wants to be addressed. But overall, the tone was very much one of maybe there'll be some minor incremental changes, but certainly no sign of a radical revolution that some people might call for. What do we think? Do we think it's time for a radical overhaul? Do we
I
think
I always like
actually
a
the system's okay and people are moaning about nothing?
I always like a radical overhaul. It's always good fun to talk about, at least. But a reductio ad absurdum. What's the point of it all? What are we doing? Are we really assessing for any particular purpose? What is that purpose?
Well, I think if we're talking about GCSEs, the purpose would appear to be mainly to create rank orders of students in different subjects to find out who's the best and who's the worst, in order to sort them into pathways into post 16. And then post 16 assessment seems to be to work out whether they're suitable for university courses. And the whole logic of assessment is that it benefits the whoever's sitting at the next stage. It's to enable yourself to crawl through a portal to open a gateway into something else, more than perhaps a celebration or a statement of what's been achieved. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, Martin.
Yeah, I mean, the actual system seems to be its own reductio ad absurdum, it really, doesn't it? I mean, it seems a crazy system to want to sort everyone out in that way. I mean, there are ways perhaps that students might want to sort themselves out, for instance. But, you know,
Mm.
call me a revolutionary.
My goodness, what do you mean? Sort yourselves out.
But
Yeah, get
can we?
yourselves into groups.
Yeah, well, somewhere along the line, yeah. Follow the passion or whatever. One thing I'm interested in this thing about passing and failing, because obviously we've got a system that seems to revolve specifically around two subjects, and then science as well. But maths and English seem to be the core of the core, the most important subjects, and yet we have a system which allows people to, I will call it fail, because we do say anything below a 5 or a 4 is a fail throughout, certainly certain places like
Mhm.
employers and perhaps universities. They certainly draw a line at these points. So should we actually say that no student should leave school with a fail in English and maths? In other words, it should be a school's duty that all must pass those two qualifications, because they are the two that seem a gateway. And if schools, after 13 years in some cases of schooling, can't get kids to pass a GCSE or equivalent, and that might be something worth thinking about, in English and maths, therefore leading them into all sorts of problems in their futures, then the school system is failing kids.
It's definitely a point of view, and it certainly does feel that if you spent 11 years in school, the idea that you're leaving with what feels like nothing seems a remarkable indictment of the system. But I think part of the issue is the way what is to think about what the GCSE is for. If it was a benchmark of what had been achieved, what had been learned, and therefore a stamp of approval to say this individual is both numerate and literate, they they can go off into the world, and we're relatively confident that they won't mess up, then it would have to be quite a different set of courses, perhaps. Obviously, I know the English courses far better than I know the mathematics courses, and the one of the issues with English GCSE is it's a really strange mix of something that's purporting to be in some way an academic subject, and something which is content free, generic. Can children write stories,
Mm.
and can they read stories and sort of make inferences about those stories? And it's not it doesn't seem unreasonable for somebody to look at the substance of that qualification and say, why does that matter? Why is that something that we're desperate for young people to prove that they're able to do?
And yet it's the one we we say does matter. I mean, there's the idea of enculturation, socialization, all these things about becoming a citizen of the nation or whatever. It's saying it's you're passing through for a reason to do these courses. Why are we doing them? So to become something that we're not when we start school. So there must be some sort of what's in it for the kids who don't pass these things. You can see those at the top end. We're always talking about those at the top end. You get them into Oxbridge and all the Russell Group universities and the importance of that. And that seems to be the importance of the whole system at one level. But at the other level, it seems to be, well, and the rest of you. What happens to you? Well, at the
Yeah,
very bottom, we've got a long
the
tail of
also rans.
underachievement. We call it, and we call it every year, saying we've got a long tail of underachievement. Well, of course we have. We've got a system that actually encourages a tail of underachievement.
Yeah, there is a bit of a misconception that GCSEs have failure built in, and that there are set pass rates, and only a certain proportion of candidates taking a test are technically allowed to pass, and that's not quite correct. Yeah, but if you assume, as we should, a normal representation of ability uh, year on year, given a big enough sample of the thousands of students that do it each year, is a reasonable assumption, then it is de facto built in that some children's performance is going to be such that it's not going to achieve a grade 4, and certainly not a grade 5, just by dint of where they are on that curve. So should we have a suite of qualifications, or at least some qualifications, which weren't assessed in that way? Well, we certainly could. It would be certainly possible for us to have some certification of numeracy and literacy, for instance, where we just had a pass fail mark, and that we could work towards getting people over a particular benchmark. And after all, that's the way in which the driving test works, isn't it? That
Yeah,
you can have as many attempts as you want to pass it. We tend to assume that pretty much everybody can drive, given sufficient practice and sufficient instruction. Maybe we're mistaken in that. Maybe there's some people that really shouldn't be driving that are, but that's not the way that we've set up that particular system. And we could set up a system for school leavers that operated in a similar way, couldn't we?
yeah. I think it seems the sensible thing. Um, to have something that everyone can pass that gives them, the accessibility to jobs, to whatever else they want to do throughout their life, accessibility to reading and writing, and also the ability to add up, basic numeracy, all these things which we think are useful. And to have, when I say an almost pass test, I mean almost pass. It's not just for a certain section, but it could be younger than
Mm.
16. It could be taken when ready, and that's the thing I think that's important, when the school recommend that this child is ready. And it could even be for some children year 6, so year 6, 7, 8, 9 perhaps, that these tests could be taken, and they then act as, well done, you've done this at school, now we can perhaps look at other qualifications should we need them. I mean, do we need as many GCSEs as we've got in the system anyway?
No. So one of the things that I've been reading in this week is a Guardian article by Sally Wheel. It's called "They're Making Young People Ill. Is it time to scrap GCSEs?" Which we'll give a link to in the show notes. And one of the things that she talks about in this article is that students in England typically sit between 24 and 31 hours worth of exams in year 11, and that's double, or even triple, what the total is in other countries. So for instance, in Ireland, children do around about 16 hours worth of exams, and in Canada, And obviously, Canada's lots of different territories. So in some parts of Canada, it's as little as 10 hours of exams. So you can it's clearly possible to run an education system where children are doing fewer exams. Is that desirable? What's the point of doing as many as we're doing?
I find little point in it. I think it's because all our exams have found themselves to be high stakes, and with performance eight and other
Mm,
sorts of measures that we brought in over the years, that we think that every GCSE is as high stakes as every other GCSE. But and also through that, the type of assessments we use because of that, we've sort of got into a whole problem with validity and reliability and about the whole thing. So I'll give you an example in drama. When I started teaching drama, I did a GCSE. I taught a GCSE that was 100% practical. When I finished teaching drama
yeah.
a couple of years ago, the exam GCSE was 80% written exam. Now, to me, that is a crazy
Mm.
turnaround, and it's destroying the subject in the name of reliability. So you've got a completely invalid exam, which is more reliable because of the high stakes, necessity of measurement. Now, what you could have is a suite of subjects that you're taking, which are recognized in different ways, which are suitable, which are valid for those subjects, which allow you to have a breadth of education, but not necessarily the stamp that says you've got a 9 in this, you've got an 8 in this, you've got a 9 in this. That you've taken, you were excellent drama performer, you were an excellent musician, you were excellent sports person, whatever it happens to be.
So what you'd have you'd have a mixed economy of different kind of gradings for different exams.
Yeah, a different level of, when you're looking for accuracy. I mean, I think one of the things is it Rob Coe talks about accuracy, the importance of accuracy. Um, there are some exams which just aren't accurate. You can't have an accurate practical drama
Yeah.
exam. It's a very subjective thing that you're marking. It is with lots of the arts.
Yeah. I mean, there's a difficult. I mean, you can be accurate and unreliable. You could imagine, somebody having, uh, throwing darts at a dartboard, and they're aiming for the triple 20, and they're consistently, maybe the darts are clustered very accurately in the double two, and that's accurate, but it's not what's being aimed for. So accuracy is limited in terms of what we're after, but it's certainly part of something that we want, and that's definitely one of the reasons why we have the length of examination time that we do. That for instance, if you look at subjects like English, like history, essay-based subjects, drama, I'm sure as well, the reliability of those subjects is around about zero point 0.6, which means essentially what that means is that about 40% of the time a different examiner would give a different mark for a given student's work, and that in order to improve the level of reliability, we would have to increase the number of hours that students spent being assessed, so that exams became even longer. Instead of doing 31 hours, it would be 60 hours, which is clearly ridiculous. So we sort of trade off what we think of as good enough in terms of reliability with long enough in terms of time spent being assessed, and it's an uncomfortable trade-off, and it doesn't really work for students in spending their summer doing these endless hours of exams, and apparently, reportedly, feeling increasingly stressed and nervous and ill as a result of jumping through all of these hoops.
Is it also the amount of pressure schools put on them, because schools also have that pass mark? that they are doing well, so they are
Yeah.
a good school because this is a school where you pass your exams. So the teachers over the 2 years or 5 years or more are saying to the children, you must pass these exams at the end. They're your gateway. If you don't get them, you fail. And if you fail, God knows what's going to
Yeah.
happen to you. So you have to get these things. So the amount of stress that's put on is the system, not just the exam itself.
Yeah, there's no doubt that that's true, and I think back to when I was the very first year of student to do GCSEs, and no one really cared. Is my memory, sort of doing GCSEs in 1988. And I remember my history teacher taught the wrong course. So we sat these papers where
That's
no
all in
one
the past.
recognised anything that turned up in the exam. It's all in the past. Yeah, we'll be fine. And that nobody was really interested or ever spoke much about how we did it. It was assumed that how we did in our exams was entirely our responsibility, and over the certainly when I started teaching in the late 90s, you talked about doing a drama exam that was 100% practical. When I first started teaching English, it was 100% coursework, which is hard to imagine now. And a bit of a nightmare towards the end where we were just trying to catch children in nets and sort of make them write things on scraps of paper and chuck them into their portfolio. And yeah, very stressful for the teacher. And that over time we've almost sort of created a situation where children are less and less responsible for their own results, and the school and the teachers become more and more responsible for those things. And that's probably not good for either constituency.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because if it's in the child's mind that they're out of control of the grade they're going to get, actually that is a very stressful thing as well, because you don't have agency, and the less agency you have, the more stressful it can be. The thing about having longer and longer exams that become more accurate, there's an argument there for continuous
Yeah.
assessment then, isn't there, which I think is also, like you say, how it's done depends, and what it actually means in practice is that something else you could argue about. But the idea of being every day, give or take a few weeks or whatever, but every day you're being assessed, and that is adding up to your final grade, that can also be quite stressful, I would have thought.
Yeah, it absolutely can. And I particularly remember my youngest daughter. She was in she was in year 11 in the second year of exams being cancelled. And with, I think it was that centre assessed grades rather than teacher assessed CAGs or tags, I can't remember now. But whereas my eldest daughter was in that first year where they finished school in March and they were just given a grade without sort of having much knowledge of what was going on. In my youngest year, they spent the entire year being given fairly high stakes assessments because nobody was sure what was going to happen, and that was very stressful. Yeah, she didn't enjoy that at all. Um, and it's interesting. Just very brief bit of etymology, Martin. The word assessment, the root of it is from the Latin for sitting alongside. It's the same root that we get our word assistant from. And so assessment is meant to assist. It's meant to assist maybe the process of teaching. And the it's walked from that, hasn't it? It's now, we talk about assessment being the tail that wags the dog.
Mm.
It's no longer the assistant. It's the end goal. It's the final logic of the process.
Yeah, and it gives us the difference between perhaps formative and summative assessment between those things. Perhaps the assistant is more the formative idea of assessment. It's actually here to help you find out how you're doing, for you, perhaps even for your own good, in the sort of ipsative process. Am I getting better? Am I progressing at all? and that sort of
Mm.
idea of self-assessment, the teacher helping you with that process, trying to be better against yourself. But the idea of summative assessment is done at the end. You're compared to other people. Perhaps it's norm referenced or criteria referenced, or a hellish mix between the two. That can therefore,
We call it GCSEs are officially cohort
yeah.
referenced.
So that you're put in that sort of block of people to work out who you are, where you are, what you're doing next, and it's I suppose a diagnostic form of assessment as well in that sense. What is the difference with summative assessment, though? We think it is an important thing to have at the end of at end of exam period, but the idea of formative assessment is something which teachers are taught about and the importance of, and but even that is becoming more and more around exam criteria, or seems to be being judged a lot by the GCSE and or A level and or SATs or whatever other exams people are doing, that you're actually looking at. I mean, I know schools that a child arrives in year seven and they're given the GCSE criteria in their subjects in year seven, and the whole course from that age, in the ones that go through, that is, like English and maths and sciences, they're given that as the expectations right from the beginning. I mean, is formative assessment becoming a slave to summative?
Yeah, rightly or wrongly, think of them as you will. But that was something that Ofsted really tried to root out over the
Mm.
last few years under the Spielman regime, and it was a real red flag during inspections that you'd often see in reports, inspectors being critical of children being asked to do GCSE style assessments too early. So schools were very much discouraged from doing that. So if there are still schools that are doing that, it's in the teeth of people telling them, urging them not to do it. So that's interesting in and of itself. And obviously, that I'm not saying that doesn't go on anymore, but I think what almost always goes on in most schools is that Key Stage 4 definitely devolves to the curriculum becomes the GCSE specification, and in some subjects the GCSE specification is almost devolves to the content of the test papers. That's certainly what happens in a subject like English language GCSE, where there is no content, there is just knowledge of the exam papers. And so the only thing that most teachers feel that they're able to teach is what the exam papers look like. And then children spend 2 years learning about the exam papers. And so the process of then assessing them, have you learned what the exam papers look like? Have you learned what the examiner is going to be looking for and responses to the questions on the exam papers becomes a real self-defeating logic.
Yeah, it sounds horrible, actually. I mean, it sounds like a non-subject from that aspect, except it exists
Not great.
on a GCSE paper somewhere. But that is an absurd situation to get into, where the paper is the subject. And does it say that there's a weakness in the GCSE
Yeah.
generally, that if we are basing our studies around the GCSE paper right from year seven, and that is thought of as a bad thing, isn't that some sort of problem with the GCSE? Shouldn't it be a celebration of all our studies, that, here we are, we've done all this, and here's our celebration of it. We're showing all this knowledge that we have learnt for some reason or other. Um, shouldn't it have something to do with what you do in year seven? I mean, the fact that we're worried about that says that there's a limitation in the GCSE, that actually it's a limiting factor rather than an expansive factor.
Well, I certainly think so, Martin. Yes, but yeah. It, yes, and I think there are thinking. There's lots of different ways to think about different subjects and how they could do that better. And so that seems to be some of the logic that's coming out of the messaging from the assessment and curriculum review, which is much more about iteration, as we said at the beginning, rather than revolution. That looking at the structure of different subjects and the structure of the way they're assessed and thinking about doing it better. And that's one way of doing it. But there are lots of other uh, people out there, lots of bodies out there who want to get rid of GCSEs altogether, who think it's that this high stakes way of assessing people is unfair. There's people like Tony Blair,
Who?
who has said we cannot rely on them alone. Tony Blair, you probably heard of him. I think he used to be some sort of politician.
Ah, right.
We cannot rely on GCSEs alone. They only measure certain skills. They do not always do this accurately, and they invite narrow teaching styles aimed at passing tests rather than building other key aptitudes. What kind of aptitudes might we want to measure that can't be measured by GCSEs, Martin?
I've got absolutely no idea. The idea there with skills and aptitudes, then they are about knowledge. I think that was the whole point of the Gove reforms, and Blair is probably harking back to the sorts of ideas they were trying to bring in their curriculum reforms, etc., which were more skills based, etc., and aptitudes and all these other things that were piled onto their curriculum review that they brought out quite late in the balls years, wasn't it? Interestingly enough, but what does
Yeah,
GCSE tend
lots of
to?
balls.
Yeah, but it tends to. People talk about long-term memory and this sort of stuff. There's a lot about a GCSE working on memory, memorization, the fact that you can't take your books into the exam, etc. in some subjects, or certainly not notes in the margins like you used to be able to. Um, there's a lot about
Mm.
memorization, the importance of that. Now, interestingly, if he says that skills aren't the thing that's coming out of this, is memory actually a big part of it, what people are saying? I mean, do we know that in 20 years after your GCSE, people still remember the content?
I think that's probably unlikely in lots of cases. Um, and the way in which because they're so high stakes in nature, that certainly encourages a system where we're doing lots of cramming as late as possible before we actually sit these exams, and there's pretty good evidence out there that that kind of preparation can be really, really effective for remembering things in the short term, but is unlikely to result in people having strong memory many years later. So it's probably a bit self-defeating in that respect.
So we've got a system that doesn't teach us skills or doesn't test our skills and aptitudes and doesn't really test our knowledge either. So that's quite good, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure it doesn't. I'm not sure we should necessarily take Tony Blair's word for it. He's not necessarily particularly expert in this area. But I would definitely say that if GCSEs aren't testing skills that we think are important, then they're not doing anything useful. So then the argument would be: are they in fact testing skills that we think are useful? And the I think it's a bit unfair to say that they're not. I think it's a bit unfair to say that all of the exams are just asking children to spill out memorized knowledge. I think there's much more. There's a reasonably strong case to say that they're expected to apply that knowledge in all sorts of ways. But are there better ways of doing things? And one of the big things that came out of the Gove reforms that you just referenced, was the fact that we got rid of coursework because we in most subjects because we felt it was prone to cheating and gaming and all sorts of things, which may or may not be fair. But now we're in a situation where, due to the nature of the support that you're able to get through large language models, AI, the idea of doing non-examined assessment becomes even more problematic, doesn't it? It's hard to imagine a system where we would want more of that now.
Yeah, it's interesting. It ties in perhaps with what we talked about last week in the oracy episode. Actually, there's more of a case now for discussion in classrooms, not only
I
just to
just,
find out what people know, but to expand what they know, to take them away from the idea of the written word into the spoken word as part of, the palette, but certainly an increase in that side to help people in their thinking. And we're trying to get people to think speaking is one of the best ways into that, I suppose. So, you know, in terms of the skills we want people to learn, the GCSE,
yeah.
what the GCSE perhaps helps us do, are those skills for universities? What are those academic? We're talking
Mm.
academic skills for. And we've got everyone taking GCSEs with about just under 50% of students then going to university. It's the other 50% who've done all those, learnt all those academic skills. For what purpose?
Well, probably haven't
Well, there
in
is
a
that as
great
well.
many
Yeah.
cases. Yeah. Yeah. For what purpose? I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. The when we look at the fact that only 50% of students are likely to go to university as a maximum, we need to be asking much more carefully what's the point of school for the 50% or more who don't follow that route. That those children need to go out into the world and have some benefit for their 11 years of time spent in the system. And it's not necessarily clear at the moment what those benefits are. Clearly, we want them to be able to read, as we've talked about. We want them to be able to communicate, and we want them to be numerate to some degree. But whether that involves all of the things it currently involves, I think we're kind of agreed that are problematic and need some sort of reform. I've got a little quote here from um, Lee Elliott Major, professor of social mobility. And he says, I think you'll like this, Martin. He says GCSEs are failing the fairness test. We must face up to the stark truth that they reward children not just for what they know, but for the resources their families can draw upon, whether it's extensive help via the booming industry of private tutors or the middle class assumptions embedded in our curriculum that alienate and disadvantage those lacking a particular cultural capital. And we talked a few weeks ago about a Sutton Trust survey which suggested that almost half of students were receiving private tutoring, particularly in London, I think that was, and that again, I'm referencing the English language GCSE. Year on year on year, the tasks that students are asked to do seem to involve this sort of middle class tariff. So this year, children were asked to write about the importance of green spaces, and if you're from particular parts of the country, you're maybe not going to have much to offer on that kind of prompt. And so maybe Major's Lee Elliott Major's got a good point here.
Yeah. It's the interesting thing as well. The 50%, of course, was something that was brought in the Blair years, and a sort of follow
The
on from,
universities, yeah.
yeah, but the follow on from the deindustrialization of the 1980s, and where people would be thought, you were factory fodder or you were for the university when 7% or whatever of the population went to university. So the huge increase under the Blair years, the getting rid of polytechnics was a sign of it, not the only thing, but the reduction in apprenticeships and certainly places to go if you were going to work. We became a service economy over that sort of time. So, and now we get to the point where we have a huge skills shortage in this country, and if we're going to try and rebuild the industrial sector or get into new areas of new industries, we're going to want, as a country, not just to import, with all the problems we're having over immigration numbers and everything else around that as well. We're going to want to create a school leavers who are ready for the workplace, whatever that workplace happens to be. And I'm going to say it, even for the jobs that haven't been invented yet. I just said that for fun.
Yeah.
Uh, but
And the
there
ones
are
that won't
jobs
exist.
where,
Yeah.
but there are plumbers, there are electricians, there are bricklayers. Who's building these 1.5 million houses that apparently are needed, or over the next 4 years? Who's building HS2? Nobody, by the looks of it. So
No one. Yeah.
and all the drones that the army are going to need. We there's a huge recalibration of the type of person, school leaver, that is needed, and also throughout, with the economy as it is, that not just stopping at 16, but there's times for re-education, to perhaps get skills in certain other areas from a business that is no longer here for one that is up and coming. That businesses should get involved in that, of course. I think hugely, by the way. I think they are a big letdown in this, but there needs to be some sort of partnership between business and also the state, trying to educate people throughout their life in vocational education. So does the GCSE carry that through or not? I doubt that the GCSE in its current form is anything, and I'm not even sure that it's helpful in terms of university, because some universities look at people coming out of school and saying, well, they know a certain amount about certain things, but they can't talk, they can't write, they can't they can't actually operate in an academic way. That that's hearsay, but whether that's true or not, we can perhaps get some comments.
Let's
People
pretend
can
it is.
comment. Let's hear some comments
Yeah.
from people whether
Here-
that's true or not.
Here's another interesting point that I hadn't considered before. This comes from Dr. Mary Richardson at the Institute of Education at UCL. And she points out the fact one of the barriers to potential reform of GCSEs is that, in her words, they're part of a massive corporate assessment industry. That there are thousands of jobs that rely on this aspect of our education system, and that's a really interesting. I'd never really considered that, but of course, all of these exam boards employ many people, and not only teachers marking their assessments, but the whole way in which they operate is going to require lots and lots of people to have vested interests in the system remaining at least fairly similar to the way it is now. Is that a problem?
Yeah, I, I don't know how many people are actually involved in it, and I certainly know people who, as teachers, are involved in it over a certain part of the summer, doing the marking and doing all these things for not that much money and for a lot more stress, but at least they get a notification that they've worked with EdXL or whoever it happens to be these days. It's interesting. We have 3 exam boards as well, of course, which confuses the whole situation even more. And I know Gove tried to reduce them to
Growth.
one
Yeah.
one exam board, but
Yeah. He ran up against monopolies law, didn't he?
yeah, which is an odd one, when
Ran
you're
into
talking
legal
about
problems.
standards across the whole
Yeah.
country, and even Wales and Ireland and Scotland as a nation. Of course, we have different systems in different parts of our own nation, and let alone how these exams compare to people in other countries. It seems a very confused system we run in this little nation of ours. So I expect there's quite a few people involved in the whole UK, working on. I think they still do coursework in Wales, for example, and I think in Northern Ireland they're looking at changing things. Obviously, Scotland has been all the time a completely different kettle of fish. They don't do GCSEs, but
No.
hey, it's a big business. Yeah, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is certainly vested interest might be saying that this is important. And then universities, of course, they are built around the idea of the A level. They don't want us to suddenly change the whole system, become a more wide ranging and a less depth, more breadth sort of system going through, which I personally have a lot of time for. But universities then say, well, hang on
Yeah.
a minute, these kids don't know enough, so we'd have to rearrange our courses. So the whole thing about changing the exam system, I think, has a lot of vested interest around it, saying, no, please don't.
Yeah. No, exactly. Do you want to know what um, Britain's strictest head teacher, Catherine Burble-Singh, thinks about GCSEs,
I
Martin?
always want to know what Catherine thinks about things.
Okay, well, so she says that she says exams GCSEs aren't perfect. All exams have problems, but she says that they hold, for her, institutions to account. It's not just about holding children to account. Most of it is about holding the entire system to account. There needs to be something, she says, to set the standard. And it's also the case that when it comes to employers, they need to have some sense of how the child has done. Otherwise, it's just a free for all where everybody's just making up whatever they're doing. And particularly in light of what you've just said about universities, I think that's an interesting discussion to have, because obviously that's exactly the way universities operate. That we have these degree classifications: first, second, third, and 2-1, 2-2-2, and there's this sort of external idea that they hold some kind of inherent meaning, but we all know that they are arrived at in completely different ways. There is no standardization across universities. They do pretty much whatever pleases them, and they're not held to account in any external way. And maybe maybe that is a problem. Maybe it isn't. Maybe the argument that Catherine's making there about GCSEs holding institutions to account, maybe that doesn't matter as much as we think it does, or maybe it does. What do you think, Martin?
Well, I mean, if the GCSE, we've already discussed the GCSE and found it to be wanting, and if it's
Yeah.
something wanting that's holding us to account, then perhaps there's a problem in that, So the flaws in the GCSE holding us to account, I think we need to rethink that through. If it was
Do we need to be held to account, though?
well, that's the other thing. I mean, universities seem to be passing more and more students at first class honours, and I think if you look at the grade inflation that's happened over the last few years, it mirrors what used to happen in the old days with our GCSEs, and which was like Red Square, at the height of the communists, with the number of tanks going through. We have more every year, comrade. We keep counting them through and celebrating these increase, how everything's increased. And of course, you just go around the corner and all the tanks have broken down. Uh, but
Yeah.
that's by the by. But if we're being held to account by a system which is flawed, and we don't know how flawed, but I'm sure some of the exams are more flawed than others. I mean, one thing that surprises me about the flaws in the GCSE, and we don't know if a grade 9 in physics is equal to a grade 9 in maths, is equal to grade 9 in English, is equal to grade 9 in music. We don't actually know if they're equally as hard
We
as each
do.
other. No, we don't.
We do have data. We do have data on that, and we know that they're not equally difficult. We know
That's
that some subjects
Sorry,
it's much
that's what I
easier
meant.
to get grade 9s in than others.
That's what I meant.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean,
So we know for a fact they're not equally difficult. Yeah.
yeah, we don't know if they're equally difficult, right? What we do know is that some are more easy to get, but that doesn't mean, of course, that it's not. I think one of the easiest to get is the higher maths paper or something like that. I think is or the one that goes along. I can't even remember it. There's the higher maths, but then there's a further maths paper, which I think it's
There's
the
a
easiest one to
statistics
pass.
paper, isn't there?
I think so. I don't know. It's the
Is it
easiest one to pass in
statistics? Yeah.
terms of statistics, literally. But I think it's because the
It's
kids who take it are
statistically
more
the
likely
easiest one.
to.
Yeah.
But the kids who take it are more likely to do well in it. I mean, so that's the problem with judging it in those ways. But there's never been anything done about making sure that a 9 is a 9 is a 9 is a 9. There's never been any work on that because people just don't know. They've got no idea. So if you've got 5 9s, it could be, there could be a huge discrepancy in those in
They
those
could.
things.
It probably speaks well of you, though.
Well, it speaks well if I mean, what are the skills that Tony Blair said? If you've got 5 9s, what are the skills you've shown there? I mean, he would be a bit disappointed with those skills, but
He
what?
doesn't. He doesn't say.
No, but what would
He
those
doesn't.
skills
He's
be?
not interested in skills. He wants aptitudes, Martin.
Aptitude, so character, personality,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
those things.
Probably. I don't know.
But that's what employers
Yeah.
want, isn't it?
Well, what do employers want, and should that matter? Should that be the reason that we set up an education system based on? If employers want something, why can't they? Why can't they do it?
Yeah, I
Why
think
can't they
there's
train their employees in the skills that they want?
and but they do want. I mean, I think a lot of employers just say 5 GCSEs or something for old time's sake, didn't they? 5 GCSEs, including
Yeah.
maths and English. I mean, as just a basic idea. But we've already said, let's talk about that English and maths thing and try and make it that all have that at least, or something equivalent to that when they leave school, and at least the employers will have something useful that actually says this person can count, this person can speak, this person can write, this person can read,
Read,
or
or yeah.
something like that.
So, so we appear to have agreed, Martin, that we do want to reform GCSEs. We don't think they're fit for purpose. Do we want to get rid of exams? We sort of touched on that briefly. Do we want to get rid of exams?
Well, that's the interesting point, isn't it? Because funnily enough, I think exams have a purpose, and I will go back to the my experiences as teaching drama. It's the extraordinary thing with the exam that it gave us not only something to aim for, but something to celebrate. That because we do a show that we created, that they'd created themselves, and they put in front of an audience and examiner, and it was a great moment for a lot of people involved in it. Here's what I've done, here's my great thing, and it's in full view of lots of people. I'm not so sure about a written exam done in the corner, but I think that could be celebratory in terms of a summation of a great teaching that you've had that year, or those 2 years, that great experience you've had with other
So,
people and things like that. So it can be a celebration of knowledge, of
is
learning.
that are there other ways of doing it? So the idea of, like, for instance, what they do in the States, found grade point averages and then doing SATs on top of that. Is that a way of celebrating these things, or are exams a better way? What's
It
the
has
argument?
it has that it depends the level of stress. I think there's a certain level of stress towards something that makes an achievement possible. So just like winning a football match, running a race, doing those things, a certain level of stress in the preparation that says, great, I've done something, I've achieved something, I can feel I've achieved something, rather than a continuous drip, drip, drip. So
Okay.
there's these moments that actually, passing through something to get somewhere else. And that I think it has an interesting thing. Now, whether that has to be in every subject in the same level, at the same extent, all those things is a moot point.
So just to pick you up just slightly there, are you suggesting that a certain amount of stress is a good thing, Martin? Often, normally, we're looking at stress and going terrible. We want our children to have beautiful, stress-free existences, but you're saying maybe a little bit of stress is good,
I think it's slightly beyond subject, but if you have no stress, you have nothing to get up for. You just lie in bed all day.
right? So so exams introduce some necessary stress into students' lives that actually give them some purpose.
There's a level to that, but like I'm saying, that there's a level that can go to too much. With all these things,
Yeah, of course.
there's a pendulum that
Have
swings
you come across
between
the idea of
extremes.
Well, or have you come across the idea of eustress?
Oh,
Spelled
there you
EU,
go.
eustress,
Go on.
good stress. So essentially, it's one of these U-shaped curves that
Mm.
there's a sweet spot where too little stress, as you say, there's no reason to get out of bed. Too much stress, crippling anxiety. But there's a sweet spot where we're experiencing stress at a healthy level. It gives us purpose, it sharpens our performance, and that's probably beneficial. But on that note,
On
Martin,
that note,
let's
absolutely.
leave it for today. I know you've got places to get to.
People to see,
Thanks
things to do.
everybody for watching, listening, wasting your time with me, David Didow, and with
Me, Martin Robinson, and like and subscribe and do all those things, and see you
Martin
next week.
Robinson. Bye
Take
bye.
care. Bye bye, one and all.